Hello everybody, and welcome back to the next lesson in this series of lessons on the immune system. I hope everybody managed to work your way through the first presentation, and that if you've had any questions you've contacted me so that I can get back to you and give you some advice on that. Again, you're going to need your textbook, pages 302 to 337, and now would be a very good time to find the list of words which includes all the terminology and new terms, because we're going to come across a whole range of different terms in this presentation, and it would be a good idea to try and fill that in as you go along so that you understand what they are. Because this is quite a long presentation, I've decided to divide it into two halves. So we're going to see, in this session, we're going to see the first half. So we're going to see part one, and then I'm going to do part two in a separate presentation. Otherwise it does make this quite a long thing to listen to, and at least then you can have a break, and it shouldn't really then take you more than about 15 minutes to do each one. So let's have a quick look at what we're going to do in part one of this presentation. We're going to be having a look at the role of the non-specific immune defences against pathogens, and particularly in this presentation we'll be looking at the non-specific barriers, so the physical barriers that the body has to actually protect itself from being infected in the first place. And we'll also have a look at the different types of phagocytes and their structure. And at the end of this we'll go on to part two, where I'll be discussing how those phagocytes work and how they coordinate their activities with other parts of the immune system. So the body has to try and defend itself from actually getting microbes in the first place, and we have various different methods for doing that. We have physical and we have chemical barriers which prevent the pathogens entering the body. Now it's far better to actually prevent them getting in the first place than it is to actually deal with them once they're there. So the first half of our immune system is the non-specific defences. These are really important. They involve things like the processes of phagocytes actually digesting the microbes if they get under the skin and into the tissues, an inflammatory response which also tries to limit the way in which the pathogens spread. We've also got the actual physical barriers, and then we've got a more tailored response, which is the specific defences, and these ones are the ones which actually learn about the pathogens and make sure that should we come across them again, we can actually fend them off more accurately. So our immune system then is divided into two halves, the non-specific system and the specific system. And we're going to first of all today have a look at the non-specific system. So the non-specific system is divided into two halves. The first half are the physical barriers, the actual ways in which we stop those diseases getting into the system in the first place. So they're really important. They probably form the most important part of our immune system. And secondly, the way that cells work in a non-specific way to actually try and destroy any pathogens that do actually come into contact with our tissues. And these ones include things like phagocytes, and also another group of cells called mast cells, which you probably won't have heard of before. Phagocytes are divided into another two groups, and these are what we call the neutrophils and the macrophages. So we're going to have a look at the non-specific system. Now, the non-specific immune system is present right from the moment you're born. So although we like to think of babies having no immunity, they don't have any learned immunity, but they do have some ways in which they can defend themselves. And although the defences don't distinguish between different pathogens, they do work the same for every single thing, and they are quite effective. So we would describe this inability to learn the pathogens as non-adaptive. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily not effective, it just operates in a different way. I'm going to start by going through some of the physical barriers and actions that prevent the body becoming infected in the first place. Now, most of these will be something that you will be familiar with from GCSE, so I suspect that this will just be a little bit of a recap for you. So the first one are chemicals which the body produces. These chemicals include things like lysozyme, which you find in tears and urine, and things like hydrochloric acid, which is in the stomach. The stomach and eyes and respiratory tract are very vulnerable to microbes getting in, and in fact these are probably the main places where they can get into the body sort of continually. So the body really needs to have ways in which it prevents that from happening. Hydrochloric acid has a very, very low pH, and so it means that any microbes that get into your food or into your water are going to have to be able to survive this very strong acidic environment if they're going to actually get through into the rest of the body. We have mucous membranes. These are the cells which line the respiratory tract, the nose, throat, and these will produce a gooey material called mucus, which I'm sure you remember from doing the gas exchange topic. And this really slows down the microbes by making it very difficult for them to actually get into the body because it glues them down. We've got the epidermis of the skin. The epidermis of the skin is quite thick, and it has lots of protein layers like keratin and so on the surface, and this makes it very difficult for the microbes to actually penetrate into the tissues. And if you do get any breaks, then blood clotting is there to immediately prevent that cup from being open for too long. It also obviously prevents the blood loss, but one of its main job is to actually seal up the wounds, so stopping things from getting in. Lastly, we've got things called expulsive reflexes, and this is things like being sick, so vomiting and sneezing. So if you have anything that gets into your respiratory system, it might cause you to sneeze, and that then hopefully expels the microbe from the body. But actually, as we know with this particular COVID-19, it also spreads the disease around the body, around society as well, so we just be very careful about that. So what triggers off an immune response at the beginning? So we've come across these chemicals called antigens. Now antigens will stimulate an immune reaction, and these are the molecules which are located on the surface of all kinds of cells. Every cell has antigens, and they could be proteins, they could be other molecules like lipoproteins or glycoproteins, and these ones identify the cell as being either belonging to you or not belonging to you. We all have these proteins on our surface, and our immune system has to learn our unique pattern right from the beginning. So right in the early days, our immune system learns this individual pattern of these different proteins and different molecules, and is able to identify these as being belonging to you or not belonging to you. So we often also refer to this as self or non-self proteins. So I'm sure we can all think about a time when the immune response actually is not helpful, that in fact an unwanted immune response can in fact be damaging or dangerous, can actually be life-threatening. So perhaps you could try and think for just a moment of one type of disease or a couple of medical instances where this immune reaction is actually not a helpful thing, where it's not really making life any easier for you. I'll just give you just a second. Okay, and as I'm sure you've already come up with, the ones that you should be thinking about here are things like allergic reactions such as hay fever, and also whenever you might need to have tissues given to you from other people, for example like blood transfusion or organ transplants. And then this immune response actually can be a hindrance, because it actually makes it much more difficult for the body to receive these tissues, because your immune reaction will always notice that they're not really you. And obviously one of the main things that you do is you try to match those proteins as much as possible to reduce that immune reaction, but it's not possible to totally eliminate it. So this brings us on to the cellular side of the non-specific immune response, and these include the group of cells called phagocytes. Now, when we did this at GCSE, you probably just referred to them as white blood cells called phagocytes. In fact, phagocytes are a generalized term for a type of cell, and in fact there are two types of phagocytes. In fact there are others, but we only really need to know about two. They're all white blood cells, which have the correct name leukocytes, and they're being made in the bone marrow by the stem cells which exist there. So this links back to the topic that we did on mitosis, where you will have probably remember hearing about stem cells being multipotent, which will mean that these stem cells can make a range of different types of cells, but they're all blood cells. Once they've been made, they're stored in the bone marrow until they're needed, and then they're released into the blood, and then they're used to move around the body and engulf and digest materials which are not part of you, so which have been identified by their antigens. The two types of phagocytes that we need to know about are neutrophils and macrophages. So we're going to start off with this table here, and if you copy this table, and it will make it easier for you just to fill it in as you go along, and then that will summarise the next part of this this presentation. So neutrophils are the first group of white blood cells. Now we've got a diagram up in the top right hand corner there which shows what a neutrophil would look like, and it's obviously not yellow, but what we have got there in the centre is this very unusual shaped nucleus. This is what we call a lobed nucleus, and this is very distinctive and it identifies the neutrophils very, very clearly in a blood sample. Neutrophils make up the vast majority of the white blood cells. They make up 60%, and these are almost like the white blood cell police. They're patrolling around the body most of the time, waiting for an antigen to trigger them off so that they can respond and actually deal with it. They're smaller than the macrophages. Their numbers increase very, very quickly if you get an infection. So they're already there, but they will also, more of them will be released from the bone marrow if they needed. They move through the tissues, into the tissues by squeezing out through the walls of the capillaries. If you remember thinking back to your capillary structure, capillaries are one cell thick, made of endothelial cells. They have this ability to be a little bit leaky because they're not totally watertight, and that's important because we need the tissue fluid to be created by seeping out of the walls, but also the gaps in between the cells allow some of these white blood cells to squeeze through as well, and then they get into the tissues beyond the capillaries and can destroy the pathogens. They don't live for very long. Once they've done their job, they tend to be destroyed. They often form the creation of pus and stuff that you might get if you have a cut. We also describe neutrophils as being chemotaxic, which basically means that they have this ability to move towards chemicals. So taxic means moving and chemo means the chemical. On this slide you can see we've got a photograph of a neutrophil, and very nicely it shows the stained lobed nucleus in the centre of the cell. The cytoplasm around the outside has a sort of grainy texture, and so sometimes you'll see in the textbook it refers to them as being granulocytes, and the nucleus will have been stained with something like eosin, and it gives you this very dark purple colour, and you can see the red blood cells surrounding it. The macrophage is the other type of white blood cell, which is a phagocyte, and they also have a very distinctive appearance. As you look up at the top right there, you've got this curved C-shaped nucleus that is the feature of these particular types of white blood cell. They don't exist in very large numbers. You only get 4% of white blood cells are actually macrophages, and they are much bigger, which is why they're given that term macro, and they also circulate in the blood, but they will often be located in certain parts of the body where they will just hang about waiting for a job to do, such as the lungs, which is obviously a place where it's quite common to find pathogens getting in, the spleen, the kidney and the lymph nodes. So they will tend to be found in greater numbers in those particular places, ready to do their job. Again, they will squeeze through the capillary walls in order to move towards the pathogen when they appear. They are phagocytic, but they also have another role by coordinating the specific and the non-specific immune systems. So although phagocytes' job is to destroy pathogens as soon as they get in, they also have a role in actually making sure that the specific immune system can learn what's just happened, so that that can also take part. They tend to live a lot longer than the neutrophils. And here we can see we've got a photograph showing a macrophage, and the very distinctive C-shaped nucleus there is very visible. These unusual shaped nuclei of neutrophils and phagocytes seem to give the white blood cell a little bit more flexibility, allowing the white blood cells to move through the capillary walls a little bit easier. So that seems to be the reason why they have this unusual arrangement for the nucleus. So that brings us to the end of part 1 on this non-specific immune response. Join me for the second part, where we will go over the role of mast cells and various other chemicals and how they interact, and then how the process of phagocytosis itself works. Thank you for listening.